This is a picture of me. This is when I was a kid and I read typical American comics, superhero comics. This is a picture my grandmother took of me when I was about 7 years old in a cape I made out of a bed sheet with my Snoopy doll, dressed as Batman. I of course had to make myself secondary to him as Robin. My grandmother was an amazing, amazing storyteller, and as a kid I used to sit at the kitchen table across from her while she'd tell me stories about her childhood and her meeting my grandfather. And she had this incredible ability to somehow tell a story at the exact rate of time that it seemed like you were right there with her. This was part of a large construction of other paintings that were bolted together. At the same time I was doing paintings and sculpture, I was doing strips for the student newspaper, and this is one of those strips. And I sort of self-consciously decided to quit using words because I noticed when I read comics that didn't have words, I still heard sounds in my mind, and I realized that there was something going on within the rhythm of comics that could be used to somehow communicate human emotion. So I ended up doing these strips without words, but when you don't use words, you have to use more and more pictures to tell stories, so I ended up with these strips that were almost completely incomprehensible. Just a piece of paper. I mean, you don't have to always start in the upper left-hand corner. You can start anywhere, and I have to credit Richard Maguire, a fantastic artist who appeared in the last few issues of Raw magazine, for really sharpening my thinking on this. He did a couple of strips in Raw magazine where it was not quite clear where you were supposed to start, and I thought that's, genius. So in these strips in particular, it's a way of organizing information in more of a relative way than in a linear way. And to me, it's just more interesting. I mean, you can turn it, it's a piece of paper, it's an object, you should be able to move around it, you don't have to hold it a certain way. So when I'm working on this stuff, connections happen that I couldn't predict, like I line up certain images in ways, and it's the amazing thing about drawing comics is that it happens slow enough and you sit by yourself long enough that your unconscious starts to structure things or allow things to be structured in a way that your conscious mind will not allow you to do. Your mind is a very organized thing, and I feel like as a cartoonist it's sort of my job to just sit back and let my mind organize the things on the page themselves. There's no way if I tried to plan this it would come out in any sensible way. It just has to come out as I work on it. So, and I really think that's one of the powers of comics. So the book is about a 30-year-old man who meets his father for the first time, which is semi-autobiographical in my case. And he also meets an adoptive sister from his father's second marriage. But it turns out, unbeknownst to everybody in the entire story except the reader in the story, that they are actually distantly biologically related as well. So, and I thought, well, there must be other emotions that one can produce from comics. It can't just be laughter, it can't just be derision, it can't just be looking down at people in boxes and making fun of them. And at that time in comics, even alternative comics, there was a real sense of guilty until proven innocent and of superiority and sort of a sneering quality that I just felt like I didn't want to necessarily do. Sadly, I wanted to do stories about my grandmother. I mean, I love my grandmother. The first thing you see here is me, which of course is a joke because it's about me anyway. And if you open the book flat, the word itself goes across this sort of explosion here, which is supposed to look somewhat like when atoms smash into each other and they spin off in these sort of shapes, but also architectural ornament. And if you take off this band that goes around the book itself, you'll see in the very center there's a little tiny naked man, and if you read the book you realize that that's God, and it's supposed to be God creating the universe. And all of these little trails and tracings there are actually made up of the letters A, C, M, and E. So it's sort of like the creation of the world and the creation of this book simultaneously. And off to the side there was that strip that Axel mentioned. Inside the book then there's a history of the company itself, located in Chicago, Illinois, which is in the center of the United States, which is halfway between New York and halfway between California, which are the centers. Now, I told you this was really pretentious, so I apologize. Halfway between the centers of reading and seeing, which is what comics are. It's a combination of reading and seeing, and life is a combination of reading and seeing. You see, but you also read the world. And I wanted this book to be about how your expectations and how your the way that you learn about life and your expectations of life eventually affect the way that you experience and are disappointed by life. This is a drawing of the character of Jason Lint when he's a teenager that I just did in my sketchbook. And I put it in here just to show what I think of as the differences between drawing and actual cartooning. To me, cartooning is an abbreviated symbology of the way we remember the world, and drawing is actually trying to see the world. It's sort of like the relationship, ironically, between speaking and singing. And I wouldn't use this way of drawing in a comic strip. It's inappropriate, I think, especially because
it's distracting.
No, it's not distracting. I'm writing fiction, so I try to draw in a synthetic way. Where this, to me, seems more like it's more about trying to find the form and trying to see the form. If I was doing an autobiographical story, I would more likely draw like this. So, and I keep a comic strip diary, so I do draw like this. I keep a record of every day of my life. Sometimes it's one panel, sometimes it's large, sometimes it's small. I started it about 10 years ago, and I started keeping it for myself because I realized I was forgetting almost all of my life. And now I keep it for my daughter's sake, so that when she's older, she'll be able to read what at least my version of life was like before she was born and then she was young. So this is the apartment building I lived in for a while, which is a story I'm working on now called Building Stories, which will be done as a book next year. So, and that's, again, kind of the difference between the real drawing of a real building and then the way I'm using it in a more synthetic, fictional way. And it's a story about the inhabitants of the three-story apartment building. On the top floor is a young woman who lives alone and wonders if she'll live alone for the rest of her life. But she does eventually get married and has her own child. And on the first floor is the owner of the building, who's an elderly woman at the time of the other woman living there. But it goes back and forth in her memory from being a child and being a young woman. And actually Seth has a cameo there. I don't know if you can see him down there. This is the most notes that I ever take for any strip before I start working on it. This is actually two separate strips, and I just put it in here just to show. You can't really read it, but it's maybe just a few lines of dialogue or something I'd want to put into a strip. And when I start on a page, I just usually either start in the center or the upper left-hand corner, wherever I think is important, and I work in pencil. And as I go, I just sort of fill up the page, and sometimes the story ends up being the way that I planned it, and sometimes it goes in a completely different direction, because the second, as anybody in this room knows who draws, the second you draw something on a page, everything changes. Every plan that you might have had in your mind as to where it's going to go is affected by that drawing you've got on the page. All of a sudden it might look like somebody that you didn't expect. It might look like a ex-girlfriend or ex-boyfriend, or it might look like a family member, and all of a sudden they're sitting in your room as a kid and you've got a story that you don't quite understand, and if you follow that flow of impulse, I think you can end up in some very interesting places. And I think it's kind of it's similar to writing novels, but there's something about having images on a page in front of you for a suspended period of time that can take you into a different kind of memory zone. So I don't know if it's good. It might be crazy. Because most cartoonists actually do lose their minds at some point or another. So, and then once I'm done penciling it, I write in all the dialogue, which I might then change from. And then I ink in all the figures, and then I draw in all the backgrounds. And then from there, I add in the colors. So, and I also wanted to make a physical object that looked, that felt exciting. I love Joseph Cornell's artwork. I love the Marcel Duchamp's museum in a box, and I wanted to have something that had that same kind of excitement to it. But a lot of these are based on formats that are rapidly disappearing, like magazines and newspapers, that I think we feel a certain affection for, and that we all realize are going to be gone soon, I think. So, and also that, I don't want to give too much away, but it's sort of, I wanted to make something that felt almost like it could only exist in a dream. I wanted it to feel like that sort of feeling that you have where you dream that you're playing a musical instrument you've never been able to play, or you were painting a picture and then you wake up and you think, oh, but wait, I imagined that. So, which is sort of one of the core ideas of the story. So, I think everybody has that within them, and it's just a matter of finding out whether you have the patience or the ability to try to get that out. And I think in a lot of cases, almost everybody does. So. This is an experiment that I did that Ware magazine asked me if I wanted to do. This is the strip I mentioned earlier about how touching can become, it goes from affection to that of aggression sometimes. So my friend John Kuramoto and I worked on this. I figured out the way that it would work, and then he implemented all of it. But it wouldn't work with Wired, so then I sent it to McSweeney's, and then they figured out actually how to make it work on the iPad. And I was really, kind of engaged by the idea of doing this. But then when it was finally done, I just thought, geez, this seems like such a disappointment, because it's just
ephemeral.
It's just electronic information. It's like a novelty, but it just doesn't have any. It has no. There's something to me about a book that in its finitude, it has a beginning and an end, and even though this book itself is designed to not have a beginning or an end, there's something about the solidity encompassing the ineffable that has an innate poetry to it. And if you have an ineffable form containing ineffable content, then the whole thing is just ineffable and disappointing. So, to me, one of the most interactive things in the world is a book. When you read it, it happens in your brain in this way that still nobody can explain at all. It's a really kind of amazing, magical experience. And it makes me mad when people seem to feel that it's like somehow the iPad or whatever, or interactive content is going to somehow make words better or something. It doesn't make any sense at all. What I really want to do is just write stories about what it feels like to be alive and communicate honestly and emotionally with a reader. That's all that I care about, and this is just a very small aspect of it, But what it fundamentally comes down to is communicating something real and as heartfelt as possible. So.